welcome you to the speaker series for the Vashon Heritage Museum. I'm Elsa Kronquist, the Executive Director, and today's talk is on the Summer of the Saucers. Let's get to our speaker. Cyrus Anderson is a Vashon Heritage Museum board member, a docent, and a super volunteer. He's also a Captain Vancouver enthusiast who we appreciate when he takes on the persona of Captain Vancouver during our annual Virginia 5 cruise around Vashon. Cyrus, can you tell us what happened off the waters of Maury Island on June 21st, 1947?
Well, if you love a great story, I've got a great story for you. It's a story that perhaps you already know, but as Paul Harvey says, I want to tell you the rest of the story. It's a story about the Maury Island incident, an incident of a purported UFO sighting right here in our own waters that was prominent enough that it actually had a movie made for it, and this movie is available, and you can go on Google and find this for yourself, the Maury Island incident. It was one of those first steps that led to the UFO phenomenon and the UFO craze that swept not only this country, but still is going on all around the world. Out of the unknown comes a strange new terror. This flying saucer spawned countless articles and conspiracy theories and movies. One of the very best of the early science fiction movies was The Day the Earth Stood Still, 1951. And you talk about a story that's got legs. I was looking at the television guide, and 2 nights ago, the remake of this movie was done. So it's a story that's still out there and has been a story for a long, long time. I'm going to be using this slide, which is painted on the side of a building in Burien, Washington, as kind of a guide to our story. And I'll tell that story a little bit later on. But first, we need to set the story in the time of history that it took place. Going back, remember that the Germans had surrendered on May 7th, 1945, and Japan had been bombed with the atomic bombs on August 5th and August 8th of 1945, and had surrendered on August 15th. And it ushered in an intense post-war concern and even paranoia about A-bombs and about whether the Russians might get the A-bomb. We all remember, people our age, duck and cover growing up. Well, the Russians, it turns out, had had a long history of physicists working on this question. And the concern was that the Russians, at the end of World War II, had basically sequestered away a whole bunch of German scientists and taken them to Russia to work on their own bombs and advanced weapons. And we did the same thing. Wernher von Braun was brought here from the same command. And interestingly enough, for you Vashon residents, it just so happens that there's an automobile that was owned by Wernher von Braun and sold to a person who lived on this island. And it sits in a garage even today, but I've sworn myself to secrecy because the owner doesn't want a bunch of people snooping around trying to see the car. So we've got a little piece of Wernher von Braun also in this story. It's a story of international intrigue, maybe even intergalactic intrigue and aliens. It's a story of conspiracy theories and tragic deaths and inter-service rivalries between US government agencies, of spies and secret operatives, of fear of the bomb and fear of aliens and fear of attacks from outer space. It has everything in it but romance and sex. Most people, however, are familiar with the Roswell event that took place actually on June 14th of 1947 and was not reported until almost a month later. But what people don't realize is that the Roswell incident itself and the Maury Island incident were both part of a swarm of UFO sightings and talk about it in media in the month of June of 1947, and then the military and the FBI responses to that in July of 1947, such that it became known as the Summer of the Saucers. In order, however, to understand the Maury Island story, we have to back up, or at least jump forward a couple days to June 24th. There had been UFO sightings for years all over Europe, the United States, and especially right after the war in 1946 and 47, but they really hadn't grasped the public attention until Kenneth Arnold sighted 9 vehicles flying at super high speed past Mount Rainier on June 24th, 1947. Kenneth Arnold was a businessman and he had his own plane. He sold fire suppression gear, and the whole western part of North America was his territory. He was stationed in Boise, Idaho. He was on the June 24th seeing clients in Chehalis, Washington. And as he was prepping his plane to take off and fly back to Boise via Yakima and Pendleton, Oregon, he was asked to make a search circuit around Mount Rainier because there was a report that a Marine transport plane had gone down, and they had a number of people out there trying to locate that. So Arnold, on his way to Yakima, did a little kind of turnaround of the mountain. And as he was flying, he noticed that there was some kind of flashing light going off up beside his face. And he thought that he might have a plane immediately adjacent to him, and he was in extremis position with another aircraft. But when he looked around, he didn't see anything close, but he noticed in front of him and a ways off, 9 vehicles moving at supersonic speeds that didn't seem to have rudders and didn't seem to be putting out any kind of exhaust fumes, and yet were moving in concert with others kind of along the ridge of the mountain. Well, when Arnold landed in Yakima, he talked about it to the FAA people there, or the people who would become the FAA. And when he landed in Oregon, in Pendleton, he also gave some information about it. So that by the time he got back to Chicago on the afternoon of the 24th, the story was already out. And in fact, 2 days later, it was picked up by the Chicago Sun-Times. Supersonic flying saucers sighted by Idaho pilot. Estimated speed 1,200 miles an hour when seen 10,000 feet up on Mount Rainier. And the story was on. The story was picked up by a guy by the name of Ray Palmer. Ray Palmer was a journalist, or at least he featured himself as a journalist, who also was publisher of Amazing Stories, a magazine that traded in all sorts of strange kinds of things, and they were already up on some of the aspects of the UFO story, because during 1946 and 47, there had been a number of sightings, but nobody had really done much about it. But he was drawn to the particularly lurid and crazy side of stories, one of my favorite being the Lamuria Cave story. There were people that believed that these discs that were being sighted were aliens who had lived on Earth many, many, many centuries, eons ago, and had built a whole civilization in caves under the state of Illinois and in the Midwest. And that they had to leave Earth under sudden emergency conditions, and had left behind all of this equipment and these signs of their settlement, and that what the discs were the aliens coming back to reclaim their equipment and take it back to wherever it was they lived. One of my favorites, however, is a message that was actually sent to the FBI on July 4th, just a couple of weeks after these events took place. A fellow who was a ham radio operator said that he picked up a wireless message that was in code, and he decoded it and he sent it in, and the FBI actually verified that the message was essentially decoded correctly. And the message reads, "Tired of human nonsense, won't await atomic war disrupting order of solar system, so sent flying discs and will set up world order under the Martians later this year." But there were people also who took a very, very serious attitude towards that, people in the United States government, and one of the first was J. Edgar Hoover, fabled director of the FBI for 48 years. Hoover and the FBI had started to get memos and inquiries from people all over the country wanting to know whether the FBI had any information about these flying discs. And J. Edgar Hoover writes back to his second in command, DM Ladd. He said that he would be interested in being kept advised what's going on, but he says, quote, "not to be jockeyed into a position where investigative responsibility, if any were entailed, would fall on us." And so already the FBI was interested, but because of the personality of J. Edgar Hoover, and that's a whole nother story in its own, he was very, very jealous of the FBI, which was his baby, and didn't want to see it drug into other kinds of things. Well, 2 days after he had written that letter to DM Ladd saying, "don't get sucked in," comes this memo back to Ladd from another FBI agent who had sat in with a meeting with General Shulgin, who was head at that time of Air Force intelligence. And General Shulgin said, among other things, laid out all sorts of thoughts as to what it might be, including that it might have been sightings, might have been individuals of communist sympathies with a view towards causing hysteria and fear. And so he desired that the FBI would be brought on, and the FBI's job would be to interview people who saw flying discs to determine whether or not they were wackos, or whether they were sincere, or whether they may have had some other agenda. DM Ladd writes back in an addenda to that very message and passes it on to J. Edgar Hoover saying, you know, I'd recommend that we not do this because we're going to get sucked into all sorts of investigations that we probably won't have any control over. But J. Edgar Hoover, in his own handwriting, writes, I think we should do this. I would do it, but before agreeing to it, we must insist upon the full access to discs recovered. For instance, in the case the Army grabbed it and would not allow us to see it for cursory information. Well, the government jumped right into it because, of course, this is a big issue. The big question was, are these things a threat? Is this something that we need to take seriously? And scientists were rounded up and a group of people were put together to begin trying to unpack what this whole UFO phenomenon was about, whether or not it represented a threat to American security, and whether it was not, whether it was those Ruskies with the German scientists who had put up something secret to frighten people. In that group of investigators were a Captain William Davidson and a Lieutenant Frank Brown, who were part of the intelligence unit at Hamilton Field near Sacramento, California. And they traveled all over the West for weeks, talking to people that had seen different kinds of sightings and gathering stories. And they became kind of the point people for this investigation. At about the same time that Kenneth Arnold's story had broken out, Ray Palmer got in touch with Kenneth Arnold and said, you know what? I want you to do another investigation for me. And Kenneth Arnold did that. for 2 days in early July, flew all around eastern Washington, over my hometown of Walla Walla, over the Hanford works that nobody even knew what they were yet. Didn't see anything, but as he was returning back to Gowan Field in Boise, Idaho, he saw some kind of a craft doing very, very bizarre and high-speed maneuvers. And when he landed, he asked both the United Airlines people and the Air Force people that were at Gowan Field whether they had seen it, and they confirmed that they'd seen it. Not only that, they confirmed that it had been seen before by a United Airlines pilot by the name of Emil Smith, flying in and out of Boise, Idaho. So with that then, Ray Palmer wanted Kenneth Arnold to go out. He said, I've got even another story for you. It's out on a place called Maury Island, somewhere near Seattle. And so Arnold, who already was famous now, he'd only been doing this for a couple of weeks, but was known all over the United States for his interest in UFOs and whatnot, decided to pull together a meeting of people to look very carefully at this. And so at the very end of July at the Winthrop Hotel in Tacoma, Washington, Kenneth Arnold gathered together Emil Smith, the United Airlines pilot who'd had the other sighting in Boise, and Captains Davidson and Lieutenant Brown, who had also previously already interviewed both Kenneth Arnold and Emil Smith, to look at an amazing story. The story of the Maury Island incident. They gathered together and they brought in a gentleman by the name of Harold Dahl and another of Fred Chrisman, who were the people who claimed to have seen this event. And this is the story that they were told, that on about June 21st, Harold Dahl had been out on his boat, which was owned by Fred Chrisman. They had a contract to pick up logs that had broken free from log rafts here on Puget Sound and would float over and end up on islands. And he was out off Maury Island here, the same kind of view that you can see behind me, and was snagging logs with big chains and that sort of thing, when all of a sudden, he says, out of the sky descended 6 disc-shaped craft. And they had hollow centers, and they had oval-shaped windows around the outside, and they had square windows around the inside, and that one of these crafts seemed to be unstable in the air and had descended to fairly low over the water, right over where they were, and suddenly was ejecting all sorts of what they described as, what Harold Dahl described as hot pieces of lava or some kind of very, very hot material that rained down on the ship, that Harold Dahl says caused much damage to the ship, burned out a place where there was a railing. His son was on board, and his son was hit by a piece of the debris and badly burned. And the dog was on board, and the dog was killed by some of this debris coming down from this flying saucer. And he adds in a little sub-paragraph, there was even a seagull that got hit by some of this falling material. What happened then was that as this fluttering, unstable UFO was dumping all of this material, one of the other UFOs came down adjacent to it and very gently touched it. And somehow that enabled the fluttering craft to regain its stability, and the whole group of them shot off at supersonic speeds back up into the atmosphere. Well, Dahl went home and, of course, talked about this when he got off the boat, and the story started to get out right off the bat and spread rather quickly. And when that happened, as the story became known, people started calling Dahl and making death threats and all sorts of asking all sorts of questions and calling him all sorts of names. And it was a pretty harrowing experience. And Dahl says that the day after, and you can see on the dock, you see a black car and a black guy in a suit. This is this painting, by the way, again, that's on a wall of a building in Burien, Washington. The appearance of the first men in black. And this guy showed up in a black suit with no identification and a black Buick car pulled up out front, identified himself to Harold Dahl, said that he knew what had happened yesterday, right down to the fact that the dog had been killed, and took Harold Dahl for coffee to a restaurant and essentially said, "You're not to talk about this to anybody. This is top secret, and we know where you live." Well, scared the daylight out of him. And he told his friend Fred Chrisman, who owned the boat, about that. And Fred Chrisman, the very next day, June 22nd, went back out to Maury Island, claims he saw another disc descend out of the clouds, and says that he collected up samples of debris. Well, the story got out at the speed of light, as you might well imagine. The fire chief over at Harper, which is Southworth, very well known to people here in the Vashon Island area, told the story to a United Press reporter and to the Seattle PI. And that press reporter went to Dahl's house the next day to try and track down whether there was any, any substance to this story, and said that as he approached the door, there was a huge argument going on inside, and Dahl allowed him to come in, and it was Dahl's wife, who was absolutely livid with anger, saying, "Tell him it's a hoax, tell him it's a hoax," because they were getting bombarded by all sorts of people who were after him saying, "You're just trying to perpetrate a hoax." The reporter decided that that's probably exactly what it was, and he gave that piece of information back to the Seattle PI, and said to them, "Do not bother even pursuing this story. The whole thing is a phony hoax." But the story was already out and being spread about. And so the subsequent weeks went by and they kept being harassed. And by the end of July, which you can see is well over a month, about 5 or 6 weeks after this event, then Kenneth Arnold is pulling together Harold Dahl and Fred Chrisman and the airline pilot and the 2 Air Force pilot investigators for their meeting at the Winthrop Hotel. Having told their story and had a chance to kind of be cross-examined by especially the Air Force investigators, they said, "We don't want to talk about it. Forget it. There's just caused us way too much grief from the public, and that it was ruining his life." Especially Dahl said that, and that if anyone were to ask them, they would claim that it was in fact a hoax. But they said it really wasn't a hoax. The whole thing happened, but we would disclaim any of that. Ray Palmer back in Chicago had asked whether or not some of these fragments that had been purportedly picked up by Fred Chrisman the next day might have anything to do with the flying saucer stories that Kenneth Arnold had talked about. And they said they had a message back from Chrisman, and Chrisman said, "Well, maybe." But at the meeting with the Air Force officers, they signed a written statement that these particles and this slag that they had collected off the beach were not in fact from the flying saucers. The meeting went on, and during the meeting, Fred Chrisman excused himself, and soon thereafter, an anonymous tip came into the Tacoma paper that this meeting was taking place at the Winthrop Hotel, and the same tip was given to United Press and to the Seattle PI, and that there may have something to do with UFOs, and maybe there were parts from a UFO involved. Well, the meeting went on. The participants in the meeting not even aware that this leak had taken place. And they talked on through the night and into the next day. And into the next day, there were 4 more leaks anonymously listed. Excuse me, the first day there was 1 more leak anonymously listed about this. And so this group finally broke up at about 2:30 in the morning, on the morning of August 2nd. And the 2 pilots, Davidson and Brown, needed to get back to Hamilton Air Force Base because the very next day, the Air Force was becoming its own force in the United States military as opposed to a part of the Army. And there were big celebrations going on at all Air Force bases, and they had to get back to their own base in Hamilton Field in California to do that. So they took a bunch of samples of this slag, which Chrisman had brought in a cereal box, apparently, with them, and all of their notes, and they called McCord Air Force Base earlier and said, we want a plane prepared. Well, they had a plane. They wanted the plane prepared and ready to go. And at 2:30 in the morning, Captain Davidson and Lieutenant Brown and the cereal box full of supposed scraps from that Chrisman had rounded up, that they had signed off and said were not, in fact, from the flying discs, loaded that up into a B-25 bomber, depicted here in the slide up to your left, and took off at about 2:30 in the morning from McCord Air Force Base, Tacoma. They did not get far. Over Kelso, about 12 miles to the east of Kelso, something happened that caused a serious fire aboard the plane. The fire spread to the fuel tanks, which of course had just been filled up at McCord Air Force Base, exploded. The wing flew off, the left wing flew off, flew back, tore off the left rudder, vertical rudder, and the plane plunged into the ground. But by the time as it was going down, the plane had not only Lieutenants Brown and Captain Davidson, but 2 other Air Force personnel who were just along to taking a hop down to California. They got out and parachuted out. They said that as they watched the plane come down, no one else came out of the plane except right near when it hit the ground, and a burning body came out of the plane. The plane went into the ground. It was at nighttime. The 2 Air Force people who had bailed out and survived contacted police, contacted McCord Air Force Base, and a huge rescue party and investigative team literally moved in and were down there by 4 a.m. the next morning to start trying to understand what had gone on there. But the press already had the story, and literally the next day started a series of 3 leaks. One of them, even before the Air Force acknowledged that they had lost a plane, was leaked to the papers that the Air Force had lost this plane, and that it was the very plane that was involved with the people at this meeting at the Winthrop Hotel. Not only that, another leak came in and said that the plane had been intentionally shot down by a 20mm cannon, presumably to cover up the fact that they were carrying parts of a UFO spacecraft. And then another leak came in and said, not only that, but it was the same 20mm cannon that had shot down the Marine transport plane that Kenneth Arnold was looking for back on June 24th. Well, the military, which was already on the whole question of UFOs, because there had been sightings around the world, was now on task. After all, this is a US military plane with claims being shot down over US territory. And a very, very thorough investigation went on for that. But the story continued to grow. And eventually, the FBI, at the specific request of J. Edgar Hoover, had a very comprehensive report done on this. And the museum has a copy of this report, about 10 pages long. And the museum came up with the findings that the problem with this story was that no one else had seen it. It hadn't appeared on McChord Air Force Base's radar. It was in a heavily populated area, and yet nobody else saw it. And supposedly this had happened during broad daylight. And that there were other kinds of loose ends in the story. And the FBI, in its report back to J. Edgar Hoover, said that they believed that it was, in fact, a hoax. The Army Air Force came to somewhat the same conclusion, though they didn't say anything about whether or not the Maury Island incident was a hoax, but that they did not find any signs of any kind of secret cargo on board the B-25 wreckage, recognizing that the B-25 wreckage was reduced practically to ash. So the Air Force, the FBI had a report, and the Air Force had a report, but that did not stop the conspiracy theories from spreading on. Are we being told the truth? And comic books were coming out with articles about it, raising questions about whether the Army was lying to them or whether the FBI was lying to them, whether they were being lied to by their government. In September, okay, about a month after these events, at the behest of Lieutenant General Stratemeyer of Air Force Intelligence, a communication was sent out to all of the commanding generals of the 1st, 2nd, 4th, 10th, 11th, and 14th Air Forces, kind of summarizing what the Air Force's responsibilities were and what they understood the FBI's responsibilities are. And in the second paragraph, there is a sentence that it originally says that the original sentence would be that the FBI would investigate incidents of so-called discs being found on the ground. The services of the FBI were enlisted in order to relieve the numbered air forces of the task of tracking down all the many instances, which turned out to be ash can covers, toilet seats, and whatnot. Well, this same communication came into the hands of D.M. Ladd, who had already recommended to J. Edgar Hoover that they not get involved in the first place. And he references it in the second paragraph. The services of the FBI were enlisted, da-da-da-da, the ash can covers, toilet seats, and whatnot. And he goes on to say that the language used in that second paragraph was uncalled for language that tended to indicate the Bureau will be asked to conduct investigations only in those cases which are not important and which are, in fact, ridiculous. Well, that's all it took. It was the final straw for J. Edgar Hoover. Even though they'd done the reports and had cooperated, he had chafed all along about it. And he writes back this letter on September 27th to General McDonald, who was essentially like the chief staff of the Air Force. And he writes back, my attention has been called to instructions disseminated by the Air Force relative to this matter, that the FBI would investigate incidents of discs found on the ground, thereby relieving the Air Force of running down incidences which in many cases turned out to be ash can covers, toilet seats, and whatnot. It was a bridge too far. He writes, in view of the apparent understanding of the Air Forces of the position of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in this matter, I cannot permit the personnel and time of this organization to be dissipated in this manner. I'm advising the field divisions of the Federal Bureau of Investigation to discontinue all investigative activity regarding the reporting of sighted flying discs, and am instructing them to refer all complaints received to the appropriate Air Force representatives in their case. So the FBI had pulled out of the investigations, but they went on full force with the Air Force because the question still was, what are these things? And are they a threat? With a lot of concern about it having to do with Russians. J. Edgar Hoover himself kind of kept in the loop of things and received this interesting memorandum on March 22nd, 1950. So we're talking 2 or 3 years down the line. And the memorandum reads, an investigator for the Air Force stated that 3 so-called flying saucers had been recovered in New Mexico. They were described as being circular in shape with raised centers, approximately 50 feet in diameter. Each one was occupied by 3 bodies of human shape, but only 3 feet tall, dressed in metallic cloth of very fine texture. There are some other thoughts about that in more recent studies, but nevertheless, according to the informant, the saucers were found in New Mexico due to the fact that the government has a very high-powered radar set up in that area, and it is believed the radar interfered with the controlling mechanics or mechanisms of the flying saucers. The studies continued to go on at Air Force level. There were a number of major pulling together of different kinds of study groups. One was called Project Sign in 1948. There was Project, Project Grudge, interesting name. And in 1952, the well-known Project Blue Book was initiated, a project that was to run all the way until the late 60s. On August 1st, 1952, the CIA issued a directive to its own people, kind of summarizing what they had determined so far, that there had been a lot of these reports that they decided were phony, but that there were some that were unexplainable, and the writes that notwithstanding, since there are unexplainable aspects and alien origins not being thoroughly excluded from consideration, caution requires that intelligence continue coverage of the matter. Then he writes on, it is strongly urged, however, that no indication of CIA interest or concern reach the press or public in view of their probable alarmist tendencies to accept such interest as confirmatory of the soundness of unpublished facts in the hands of the United States government. The impact on Vashon. The impact on Vashon has been a long-standing interest in flying saucers and UFOs. This model being out at the airport even now. And the Heritage Museum has archived these activities and in fact scheduled the movie, the Maury Island incident, twice on island, which is why a number of people are familiar with it today, and we have notebooks of the original documents that were lost. It's kind of part of our quirky history of Vashon and seems like a very Vashon kind of thing. We had another one in February of 1968, but that will be the subject of another question. So with that, we'll open up the questioning for folks. So Elsa, take her away.
Thanks, Cyrus. So we've got a few questions here. They're from Aaron, and Aaron asks, interesting connection between the two downed planes. Any information on what the first plane was carrying or what its involvement was. And then Aaron goes on to say, was the Air Force pursuing this because they wanted to know about UFOs, or because they wanted to know why 2 of their planes had been shot down?
Well, one is I don't know what the circumstances were of the transport plane. I haven't done any other reading in our research on that. However, the Air Force was interested for a couple purposes. One, they'd lost a plane over American territory. 2, these things could be threats. And so the military was on task and highly focused at trying to understand what they were, later trying to figure out what the physics and the propulsion systems were, conferring with German scientists and German scientists who had previously been with Russia. So I don't have an answer for the first part of that question. The second is both and. The Air Force was very concerned for all sorts of reasons.
Mm-hmm. Shannon wants to know if there's any plans to show the movie again, and can it be accessed on streaming services?
The answer is probably. Also, you would be a better source of that information. We may have the movie over again. We had them here just last year. We had a packed house at the theater. There were well over 200 people there.
There were 300 people there.
300 people. Well, there
it was full.
So the place was full. We may very well bring them back. These talks are being recorded, and Elsa can give you more information on all of that.
Yeah. So do you think the incident was real, or do you think it was a scam?
I don't have an opinion one way or the other. First off, it's completely uncorroborated, and there were a lot of holes in the story when the actual researchers got into it. And if you do research on Google right now, they will say it was a hoax. Do I personally believe it and believe in UFOs? Well, I have a family story, but it would take me a while to tell you. I don't know, but I know some strange things have happened, and that my sister and my grandmother and my first cousin were involved in a very, very strange incident south of Spokane in the early 1950s with a UFO that they believed had settled down right over the highway, right in front of them.
Someone wants to know, has any of the Air Force information been shared with the public?
The Project Blue Book records were declassified, for whatever that means, and are available as a matter of public record, or at least those that they declassified. They don't talk about it, but it is assumed and I believe well known that the Air Force and intelligence people are still very interested because there continue to be incidents of sightings by airlines pilots and military pilots the planet over of strange goings on in the air.
And I know I asked the question earlier. I thought we had some fragments in the museum, but I'm not sure about that. Maybe you can answer that.
Yeah, we have purported photographs of them. Oh, okay. The photographs are real poor quality.
Okay.
And then the Air Force basically had decided that the slag was the same stuff that came from the smelter over in Tacoma. Okay. So that part has been pretty much probably debunked.
And then somebody's asking exactly where on Maury were these fragments found, and where did the saucers appear?
Good question, and one to which I do not yet have an answer, even though I have inquired of Scott Schaefer, who produced the movie in the first place. We believe it would be down between Gold Beach, the Gold Beach neighborhood, and Point Robinson, on kind of the southeast side of Maury Island. So it would have been visible had Gold Beach been there in 1947, presumably to be able to see that. But no one else did see
it. Here's the question about homesteading, homesteaders on the island. Was Fred Chrisman related to the Chrismans who homesteaded on the island? Do we know Fred Chrisman?
Don't know. Fred Crispin is a very interesting character. Turns out he was involved in the Kennedy assassination investigations and was an author who wrote short stories, science fiction stories, and it had a long-standing relationship with Ray Palmer, the magazine editor and owner in Chicago. So it's hard to know. Basically, the FBI came to the conclusion that the whole thing had been dreamed up by Fred Crispin as a publicity stunt to be able to sell articles to magazines. Whether or not he's related to the Crispins here on Vashon Island, I do not know that.
Okay. We got quite a few questions here.
It's the kind of thing that pulls up questions in people's minds.
Let's see. Well, somebody wants you to tell the story about Spokane, but before you do, okay, yeah, a couple people want you to tell the story about Spokane. And then there's questions about the Maury Island incident and where you can, some answers on where you can get it. And then thank yous. So I think that is all of our questions. I'd like to say thank you to everyone, and please tune in for our next our next talk. And I'm going to stop recording, or maybe I won't. So
yeah, let's get to.
But I want to know. So Cyrus, do you want to tell your Spokane story?
So I'm 75 years old. My sister's 4 years younger than me, and my first cousin was 2 years younger than me. And they were about 6 and 8 years old when this incident took place. They'd been visiting my grandmother up in Spokane, Washington. My grandmother, before he died, married to my grandfather, was a very prominent Republican supporter in Eastern Washington. My grandfather was, in fact, business partners with the state Republican representative for Southeastern Washington. So she had a lot of presence in kind of conservative circles. She was driving Sharon and my sister Dee back from Seattle, back to Walla Walla, which was our home, in the middle of the night, when they said that they became aware of a very bright light hovering kind of up ahead of them and far up in the air. And they realized that this light was coming down very rapidly and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And they said that then several hundred yards in front of them, a craft settled down right over the highway and hovered. It was well lit. And they said that it was so detailed that they could see different kinds of pipes and mechanical equipment types of features on the exterior of this craft. Fairchild Air Force Base is just up the road. There were testing grounds out in central Washington state. Who knows? But they said that it settled right down. It was unlike anything they ever saw before. It appeared to have no source of propulsion, and that they looked at it for several seconds, talked back and forth with each other to compare what they were seeing, and then the craft shot off just with extreme speed and disappeared completely. My grandmother swore my sister and my cousin to silence, that they would never, ever talk about that. The last thing my grandmother wanted in Republican circles in Walla Walla, Washington, was that she had seen a UFO on the highway. My sister sat on this story literally until just a few years ago. My cousin died several years ago. The story had never been told until it came up in a conversation with my sister. And she said, you know, I've never told you about this, but Sherry and Grandma and I saw a UFO. And so that's the story in our family. I suspect there are stories in other families also.
Okay, I have one more question here. Thanks, Cyrus, for sharing that. One more question. People want to know about the boat. Who owned the boat, and is it still around?
Don't know whether it's still around, but the boat played a part in debunking in that the morning of going back to the Winthrop Hotel meeting on July 31st, August 1st, they were going to then go out to Maury Island. They were going to go down and see the boat and go out to Maury Island. Well, the boat wasn't operating, all right? And it was someplace else at the time. The FBI agent who came out a couple of weeks later and did the thorough report for J. Edgar Hoover said that he went over the boat very carefully. He said that the areas, especially the roof and the roof where you would have expected burning remarks or marks of burning to be there, was still painted with old paint that had been there long enough, undamaged, that it had deep cracks in it. And he didn't see any signs of any kind of repairs having been done to the boat at all. Where the boat ended up, I don't know. It was just a small tugboat, kind of like depicted in the slide. I don't know whether it's still around. I do know that the whole incident was so chaotic that the Dahl family essentially fell apart and ended up in dispute and alienation with each other. And it was a very, very sad experience all the way around for them.
Thank you, Cyrus. Anything else you want to add?
No, I think that'll give people stuff to ponder.
Good. And we'll look at...
For me, it's just to kind of wrap up. It's a story. It's not only about the UFOs, but it's a story about how conspiracy theories grow and spread. It's a story about the press, the responsible press and the irresponsible press. And it's a story about inter-service rivalries, especially in intelligence fields, which have, to some extent, continued to exist up until fairly present times. And it's a story about Vashon Island and just how quirky we are. And it's something that I embrace as part of this strangeness, of this delightfulness that is Vashon Island.
Mm-hmm. All right. A lot of people are saying thank you. One more question did come in, and it's about they said the children, but I know that there was a son on the boat. And so over the years, did that child debunk this story also?
Don't know the full details on the son, but I do know this, that after this event took place, the son, who was I believe a young teenager, ran away and disappeared and showed up waiting tables in Montana someplace. With bandages on his arm. And then I don't know that much about how the family fell apart and where different people went. I'm gonna spend some time at some point with the guys that actually pulled this together, Scott Schaefer and all, to determine what they know about the son and the rest of the family and what happened with all of that.
All right. Thank you all very much. This concludes our talk in this series.